And the next speaker is David Oakes, speaking about respecting human rights as a sine qua non for all mental health care. David Oakes is the leader of the International Psychiatric Survivors Movement, also known as the MED movement. He has been a human rights activist to transform mental health care since 1976. He experienced 5 lockups in psychiatric institutions, typical diagnosis, forced injections, and so on. After joining the MED movement, he graduated with honors in 1977 and became free of the mental health system using non-drug alternatives. He lectures in many countries all over the world. I'm glad that he's here today. And now he lives with his wife Deborah in Eugene, Oregon. Find more information about Mr. Oakes on his website. And now I ask you to come here and give your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Peter's a wonderful organizer and activist. And I've been saying this for a while, though I did notice he used a little humor in his am I right? He used a little humor, like cartoon? I joke about that because, ask me later, but it turns out we're not supposed to be using humor at the event, or the drug companies would get mad. This is absolutely true. So my presentation is very serious, and it actually is. It's about the human rights of people in the mental health system, and that this is our strategy for Mind Freedom International. This is my 31st year doing this work, and one thing I'm proud of is that the World Health Organization has been open to hearing from psychiatric survivors, similar to what we're seeing here at the WPA, and they did say that there is a, oh, good job there, WPA. I see my image. Are any of the images? Good. Some of the images came through. That's good. That it's a global emergency of human rights violations in the mental health system. That the current situation in the mental health system amounts to a global emergency. And I think that that's an important message to get out. When there's an emergency, it ought to look like an emergency, it ought to sound like an emergency, we ought to act like it's an emergency. Not to panic or to do thoughtless things, but to work together and unite and to treat this like an emergency that it is, of mass human suffering, coercion, what amounts to torture, human rights violations, deaths in the mental health system. So this is a psychiatric survivor perspective, and I want to appreciate everybody's perspective here. It's so wonderful Peter Stastny, a psychiatrist, is going to be presenting. How many other psychiatrists are there here besides Peter? Good, all right, round of applause, yay. Very good. Believe me, that's unusual. We'll have these huge events and there'll be no psychiatrists at all, so thank you very much for being here. What do I mean by psychiatric survivor? That is defined in a lot of different ways, but I'm identifying as a person who's experienced a human rights violation in the mental health system. And we adopted the term psychiatric survivor to remember people who've been killed in the mental health system. And this is Celia Brown, who's our board president and led psychiatric survivor delegation in the United Nations to work on the disability treaty for several years. Real briefly, there's 3 types of psychiatric coercion, and it has a nice alliteration for me: force, fraud, and fear. I'm sure there's many others, but this will help explain the scope of force and coercion in psychiatry. And Leah Harris, by the way, has lost both of her parents to the psychiatric system, and herself is a psychiatric survivor. Now, force is kind of obvious in a way. We're talking a lot about that here. Coercion is more subtle than force, but force, we can clearly see, involves doing something with our human rights. The example I want to give here is where there's a forced procedure that's involving an irreversible effect on the brain. It's so intrusive that it affects the brain. Is there anybody here that, for instance, is for forced psychosurgery at this whole conference. I'll bet there's nobody here that would say that they're for forced lobotomy, forced psychosurgery. Why is that? Because it's so intrusive that even here, people will recognize that no should mean no when it comes to something like actual surgical, going into the brain surgically. So there's consensus in the world that forced psychosurgery is wrong. But what about forced electroshock? Forced electroshock certainly is worse than forced counseling, and we're against all forced procedure, but forced electroshock was experienced by both Leonard Roy Frank here, who's a real hero in our movement, and also Chris Yates. Leonard had it in the US, Chris had it in India, where she had her forced shock, and it's growing in poor and developing countries. As you may know, the medical model is very, very powerful, and a lot of the world wants to be the most modern it can be. Well, drugs are expensive. So in Turkey, Pakistan, areas of South America, we're seeing a rise of forced shock because they want to be like the West and have the medical model. The drugs are expensive, but everybody's got a generator somewhere that can get some electricity going. So electroshock is growing, including forced electroshock. It's just very common, it's been documented by Mental Disability Rights International, including without anesthesia. We're against all shock, but this is a good example of where many of us, I think here, even at the WPA, would say, let's stop forced shock. Dr. Saraceno, I've been mentioning a lot here, is the head of the mental health section for the World Health Organization, and in a document from the WHO on legal standards, there's a little paragraph in there that we helped get in there, that the WHO stand is against all involuntary electroshock, absolutely, also against shock without anesthesia. And I think that's a significant thing to bring up with people, because it's hard to stop all forced shock. We're going to do it someday, but certainly people ought to be able to say that no means no when it comes to something so intrusive as electroshock. I experienced forced drugging, and this is Larry Plumley, my friend, who also had forced neuroleptics. I was diagnosed schizophrenic. I was a working class kid going to Harvard on a scholarship and experienced severe mental and emotional problems, and I was forcibly drugged in solitary confinement more than once. I was locked up 5 times. And it was in solitary confinement that I decided to do this work. And neuroleptics felt like a wrecking ball to my mind. I know that many of our members choose to take psychiatric drugs, including neuroleptics. We can't be pigeonholed as being anti-drug. But the feeling of what it's like to have forced neuroleptics is seldom expressed in the media or at conferences like this where the issue of forced treatment is discussed. I will tell you, it felt like torture. I value my mind. Die Gedanken sind frei is a popular song here in Germany. It means that your thoughts are free. And I value that very much. So as distressed as I was, I still wanted to have my mind. And the neuroleptics were like a wrecking ball to my mind, plus I had severe physical effects. I was given Thorazine, Haldol, Mellaril, Navane. Now there are newer drugs. And as we've heard at this conference, more and more people are being forcibly drugged in their own home using court orders. 40-some states in the USA now have this, where you can be court-ordered. Thousands of people, thousands of Americans are forcibly drugged in their home now. Here's Gabe Had. We helped Gabe find an underground railroad, and he left his state and escaped forced drugging. It's very difficult. It's similar to helping a domestic abuse survivor, because you can't just give him a Greyhound ticket or a bus ticket. You can't just give him a bus ticket. He had to have a place to stay and support. But that is one resistance method we're looking into, is evading forced outpatient drugging. So why am I bringing up forced neuroleptics? We're against all force, but I think that there's a wedge point here on forced psychosurgery, forced electroshock, and forced neuroleptics, because what seldom gets discussed is that within the medical literature, the debate is over neuroleptics in the long run, especially at a high dosage, can cause structural brain change. And we have a huge list of medical articles on this. It's not really a debate within the medical profession. You can debate whether it's damage or something like that, but it's not debated anymore. Long-term neuroleptics can cause structural brain damage, brain change, and one CT scan study showed frontal lobe brain shrinkage. Okay, that's the same lobes targeted in the lobotomy. Now, we're pro-choice, but I could have been on 30 years of forced neuroleptics, and that needs to come out at events like this. I could have experienced 30 years of forced neuroleptics, and I guarantee you it would impact my brain. My frontal lobes, probably I'd have dementia, and this is now being confirmed. What we said, when I was forcibly drugged, I said, this can cause brain damage, and they told me I was crazy. I was right. They said we didn't have insight, that we didn't have awareness. I was right, and many of us are right. Neuroleptics can cause forced brain damage. So, what about fraud? Well, the pharmaceutical industry is dominating the mental health system. And by the way, it is dominating this conference. The pharmaceutical industry is dominating this conference. And a lot of, we're talking about the freedom to be free and different kinds of expression. Ask me later on. I cannot squeak this rubber nose in the exhibit hall. This is absolutely true. The conference organizers have told me that if I have a little skit where I squeak this rubber nose, Patch Adams, Clown Troop taught me, the drug companies have been complaining, and they said they'd withdraw support from this conference over this. So they have influence right here with us here. So physicians are routinely misinformed. Now this is a picture here showing Al Galves at a little skit we did where a huge hypodermic needle is controlling all those people. This is directly in front of the pharmaceutical industry's headquarters. And here's how you change it. You all pull together in the same direction, and we topple the domination of the drug industry symbolically here. And that's what we need to do here, is everyone pull together. And once more, it does not mean that we're anti-drug. It means we are pro-freedom. If we objected to the Catholic Church forcing prayer and exorcisms on people, it does not make us anti-spirituality. It makes us pro-freedom, and that's what we're about here, pro-freedom. Okay, so we talked about force and fraud. That's pretty obvious. Now, here is the big one, fear. And this is what we're now talking about in our city of Eugene. Our Human Rights Commission has been looking at human rights and mental health now for 2 years, well, 3 years now. And what we are focusing on is the human right to choice for mental and emotional well-being. The human right to choice in mental and emotional well-being. The UN declares that we have the right to care and support for ourselves. It's a human right that if you have a family member in crisis, your family deserves a range of choices. But the medical monopoly means we have very little choice. And here's my hero, one of my many heroes, Lauren Mosier, who would come to these conferences and speak out. He helped create Soteria House, which is proven to be helpful, and it's not offered to people. And then the globalization of the psychiatric industry can go in 2 directions, and this is my last slide here. The globalization of the psychiatric industry can go in 2 directions over the next decade, next 20 years. The World Health Organization estimates that there's about 100 million people that, quote, need mental and emotional care. So which direction will it go, people? In 10 or 20 years, will it be drug, 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 drug? In Africa, Asia, South America, will we see 2-year-old African children on neuroleptics? And we're pro-choice. Or, this is our vision, a nonviolent revolution in mental health care, where we have a right to say no, we have a right to full information, and especially we have a right to a full range of voluntary, non-drug alternatives, and that is a human right. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And I don't know if I have time for even one question.
Questions at the end.
Questions at the end. Okay, thank you very much.